Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three martinis coming up.
So glad you're with us for the Tuesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, and Merry Christmas Eve. We're so glad to have you with us. And if you were with us on Monday, you know that we're in the midst of our special year-end awards. This year, 7 different specials. We've never had 7 total as we go through our many different awards. If you were with us yesterday, you know we talked about most overrated, underrated, and honest political figures. Today, we're going to start on the somber side with political figures, or sometimes it goes beyond politics, figures we're most sorry to see go. And then we'll have the rising star and the figure fading into oblivion. Now, tomorrow we're going to take a break on Christmas Day. There will be a 3 martini lunch, but we're not going to do awards. We're going to reflect back to our interview with Special Agent Johnson, Robert Davi, the great conversation we had back in September. We'll talk about his time as Leonid Brezhnev in the recent Reagan movie. We'll also talk about what it's like as a conservative in Hollywood. And of course, we're going to talk about his role in Die Hard. So if you haven't heard that, even if you have, check it out. It's a very entertaining and interesting conversation. And then for the remainder of the year, we'll be talking about things like best and worst idea, best and worst political theater, most overreported, underreported stories, person of the year, and eventually we'll get to our fearless predictions for 2025. So with all that as prologue, Jim, again, starting on the more somber side as we do on this second awards episode, who is the figure you're most sorry to see go in 2024?
Well, as with many of these picks, with this one, I have 2. I'll go with my main one, and then after you mention yours, I'll mention my, I guess you could say, runner-up for that one. My number one thought, person who I'll be missing for the years to come, is the second guest we ever had on this podcast, former Senator Joe Lieberman, who was the running mate on 2000. I was not actually part of the crowd chanting "Get out of Cheney's house," but nonetheless, it's safe to say that Joe Lieberman, stood out as certainly a hawkish Democrat, by some measures a centrist Democrat, or at least he was open to some social conservatives on some issues. He had respect for traditional values. Called out Bill Clinton. Didn't vote for his impeachment, but nonetheless, he was willing to go out and say what needed to be said, or what should have been said much more widely back then. Became a hawk, particularly on the war on terror and issues like that. Democrats, progressives, hardcore liberals decided they hated him, nominated Ned Lamont. Lieberman decided to run as an independent, kept his seat for another 6 years. But he had written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that I believe it was Russia and Iran were the 2 biggest threats to the United States. We had done a segment saying, what does China got to do to get some respect around here? Did he forget? A little mostly tongue-in-cheek, and longtime friend of the program, I believe it was Tevi Troy, said, hey, I got his number. Why don't you reach out and ask him? And, the phone calls occurred, and I thought it was a really great conversation with him. And he was getting up there in years, and he was still sharp as a tack. So, look, we're right of center guys. There aren't a lot of Democrats who we, think warm and fuzzy about. But I really do think fondly of Joe Lieberman. Obviously, he had long since retired from politics. But I think by and large, but also worth noting, Lieberman was endorsed by William F. Buckley against Lowell Weicker. In a long pantheon of bad Republicans, Weicker was pretty darn bad. Like on raising taxes, and the sort of things that you'd never see a Republican get wrong, or rarely. And Lieberman was the, idiosyncratic, not down the line liberal alternative. And Buckley had, done his part for him. So Lieberman, the guests on the 3 Martini Lunch are a very exclusive club, and you will be missed.
No question about it. It's impossible not to like Joe Lieberman, even if you disagree on a wide variety of policies, which I think I did. He's just a very congenial guy and a great sense of humor. He told the story of that endorsement with his Bill Buckley impression, with the best line being, "I loathe Lowell Weicker."
Yes.
It's like, I like you, but the reason I'm doing this is I hate Lowell Weicker. So, and ultimately, Lieberman won a narrow race because back then Connecticut was a competitive state for Republicans. You're right about the impeachment. He absolutely condemned Clinton's behavior, but said it didn't rise to impeachment. And then every other Senate Democrat tripped over each other, running to the Senate floor to basically say, what he said. And then Gore picked him to kind of counter the stain of the Clinton legacy. And then 4 years later, because of the Iraq War, the party hated him. And then he was running as an independent and endorsed John McCain in 2008, was even the keynote speaker at the Republican convention. So think about the shift where he was with the two parties just over less than a decade in time. But yeah, it was a great conversation. He was definitely right up there with my choice. My choice, especially since you went with Lieberman, is longtime Oklahoma Senator Jim Inhofe, rock-ribbed conservative, spent a lot of years on armed services, also environment and public works. He had to spar with Barbara Boxer on the Environment and Public Works Committee. Can you imagine two more ideologically disparate people?
With ACU scores of 100 and 0.
Yes, exactly right. And he was one of the really strong people arguing against the Democratic climate agenda. He even wrote a book called The Greatest Hoax and whatever you think about climate change, arguing against the Democratic government to reduce freedom and just spend $1 gajillion to push forward this maybe a fraction of a degree by 2050. He saw that was all a bunch of garbage pushing a radical Democratic agenda. He was a guy who always spoke his mind. Obviously, if you were on the left and maybe even middle of the road, sometimes you didn't agree with him, but you never had to guess where Jim Inhofe stood. And as a staunch conservative, I knew that he was almost always standing with me. I also had a chance to interview him many times. A wonderful guy, very gracious guy, great staff that made those interviews possible. Also, Inhofe was also a pilot, flew all over the state visiting his constituents. He ultimately resigned a couple of years ago when his wife's health declined, and he ultimately passed away earlier this year at the age of 89. So honoring a couple of guys today who spent a lot of years together, actually, in the U.S. Senate.
Another excellent choice there, Greg. My thing, I just feel like almost obligated to mention people who I interviewed who died. Just feels like the sort of thing I should call this out. So on my way out to Ukraine for the second trip in March, London-based journalist David Knowles, who ran the Ukraine the Latest podcast for the Daily Telegraph, had a chance to just sit down with him and just, pick his brain on everything, how things were going in Ukraine at that time. He was exceptionally well-sourced and just a straight shooter. And when the news was bad, he'd tell you the news was bad. When there were reasons for optimism, he'd give you that. And it was just a great conversation. Knowles died of a heart attack, and he was only in his 30s, which freaked a lot of people out. In part, like when you're really a vociferous critic of Putin and you die young under mysterious circumstances. My understanding, it's natural causes and stuff. But I've been thinking about that conversation a lot. That sense that some days people who you think are going to be around for a long time are not always around for a long time. So take the time to express that appreciation for people in the moment, because you never know when you won't get that chance.
Exactly. Yeah. Tomorrow is guaranteed to none of us. And so we're grateful for the service of the two senators we talked about, and obviously good friends and reliable sources, good reporters who dig into the facts. We don't see that as much as we used to. And so to lose them, especially at such a young age, whenever they're younger than you are, it definitely makes you look. All right, Jim, on to most likely more lighthearted fare now as we look at Rising Star and fading into Oblivion. So who's on the rise? Who tops your list in that category?
Low bar to clear to be more lighthearted. Yes. But ironically, maybe not that much more lighthearted. My choice, I once again have my regular pick and a backup. Mike Waltz, the Florida congressman who will, there's no confirmation process, so who will become Donald Trump's national security advisor. Not terribly well known, although you look at his resume and he's just, everything you'd want to see in the, military, national security arena. I don't think the first couple of years of Trump's second term are going to be quiet. Whether you're thinking about Russia and Ukraine, whether you're thinking about the Middle East, and the tumultuousness we saw with the collapse of the Assad regime, what's left of Hamas and Hezbollah and all the other enemies of Israel, the Taiwanese Strait, China, and the sense that they are on a ticking clock and want to do this with the next. It's a whole world of trouble, and there will be the national security challenges for the United States considerably worse during the Biden years. So Waltz and President Trump and his team will have their work cut out for them. I suspect we'll be hearing from him quite a bit. And look, I don't want to poo-poo any of the important work that's done in the House, but I do think that when you're national security advisor, when you're like E.F. Hutton, when you talk, people listen. And I think we're going to be hearing from him quite a bit, and I think his words will be carrying a great deal of weight on the world stage. Yeah,
he was my first choice as well. I've always been impressed with Mike Waltz. I think Mike Waltz has a real good head on his shoulders, and is an excellent choice by President Trump. My backup choice in this category, I think, is certainly worth attention. It's not going to be in a role as consequential as national security advisor, but I think one of the things that Republicans did well in 2024 and why the presidential election and taking control of the Senate happened is because they went on offense with their messaging. In some cases, that meant going to audiences where young people are listening, like podcasts. Trump went to Rogan and a bunch of others that young people listen to. Barron's given a lot of credit by the campaign for pointing those out. But on cable news, I think one of the guys that really did that was Scott Jennings over at CNN. This is a guy that was on Mitch McConnell's staff, working in general anonymity for the most part in terms of a national audience. And then this year he became part of these panels where maybe there's one other person who's sort of on the right, and then everybody else around that big table at CNN is just foaming at the mouth with how much they hate Trump. And he's kind of like a happy warrior. He's just spits straight facts at people when they're going off, and often challenging the premise of the question about why Republicans are so evil and stuff, and putting the other panelists and sometimes the host on the defensive. And he always just, very calmly, oh, well, what about this? And, how do you explain this inconsistency or hypocrisy on your side? And so it's always the counterpunch, which is very effective. And, will he gain as many headlines now that it's a Republican administration with a Republican Senate? Given the way the left-leaning media is, I'm sure he's going to have plenty of fodder to go forward. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be fun to see what he does.
Greg, having been one of those other conservatives sitting around the table, there was an old saying in Hollywood that you never wanted to be if you're an actor, you did not want to be in a scene with a dog or a kid or Denholm Elliott, who played Brody in the Indiana Jones movies, because nobody's going to be looking at you. That's kind of what it's like to be another conservative on a panel with Scott Jennings. He is so on it. He is so sharp, pointed without being nasty, and so he's it's very easy to say. He'll be running a column for the Los Angeles Times, and I think they've already had one person quit as a result of that. So addition by subtraction, perhaps, at some institutions, but definitely a rising star. I did have a backup choice for this one. I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on it, but Dave McCormick, I think, is going to be a big player in the Senate for a couple of years to come. Almost as a thought exercise, McCormick ran in the primary a couple of years ago, lost to Mehmet Oz. Mehmet Oz lost to John Fetterman. Now you got to think about it. Look, if we're going to have McCormick, would you rather have McCormick and Fetterman, who's been pretty good on Israel and pretty good on getting rid of Menendez and says that being concerned about the border is not... It's a low bar to clear, but Fetterman's probably my favorite Democratic senator right now. That's a really good upgrade. That's actually a pretty good combination. Between Fetterman and Casey, I think I'd rather get rid of Casey. So anyway, good luck to you, Dave McCormick. I think you're going to be a big player in the Senate for a long time to come.
Yeah, very interesting to see how these new players factor in. But rising stars, Republicans actually have some, and there was not much of a stretch this year to come up with them. So, and hopefully there'll be some other ones in the cabinet to come as well.
This liberal attorney general thinks it's Amazon's fault. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. The AG of DC is going after Amazon because of delivery times in rough neighborhoods. Maybe if he would go after the crime, the deliveries would come quicker. Amazon's just protecting their employees. Whether it's happening in DC or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, Jen, this is the one I always struggle with most. This category, Fading into Oblivion. It's an award I gave to Anthony Weiner twice, and so I've always been skittish now, because part of it is this a person who was never known before, was briefly well known, and now is fading away forever, or could it be someone who was well known and will probably, if you mention their name, people will know who they are, but they're gone from the main stage forever. So it all depends on how you look at it, but who tops your list?
So I almost wanted you to go first on this one, Greg, because I'd seen two glaringly obvious choices, three if you count the Hawk Tuah girl. Folks who will just not be a big deal once 2025 starts. But so here's the question, and I figured you'd have the same two or have one of the same two. So would you prefer to spend 3 to 4 minutes ranting about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris? Since I figure both of them are destined to fade into oblivion.
See, Biden fits that second category. You're not going to forget who he was, but you're never going to see him again. But yeah. I have neither of those, actually. So whoever you had at the top of your list, go for it.
It's a bumper crop year for people who are fading into oblivion. All right. So Biden I'll do quick because we rant about Biden on a lot of episodes. But I just observed that, There's almost this like Shakespearean tragedy element to it, that this is a guy who wanted to be president his whole life. His first campaign was 1988. It had eluded him. And in 2008, there was expectation that after his, presidential campaign crashed and burned after Iowa, that he would eventually retire. And Obama picked him over Evan Bayh to be his running mate. Some people said it was assassination insurance. Nobody kind of expected him. And people used to say, wow, it is really shocking that Barack Obama is the president of the United States. But it's really, really shocking that Joe Biden is the vice president. And then somehow Joe Biden, after not running in 2016, because Hillary Clinton was, probably would have won if they'd had a primary anyway. Biden comes back 4 years later looking a hell of a lot older. But somehow he's the default setting. Everybody kind of remembers him. The 16, 17 Democratic candidates. He gets the nomination. He goes up against Trump. COVID hits. And he's president of the United States. So he finally gets what he wants at age 78, I believe. And man, we could all kind of see the problems coming from all along. Like that's the first thing that's so shocking is how predictable this set. Like a lot of us are not at the top of our game in our 80s. And unsurprisingly, Biden's energy level, the number of hours a day he could work, how much he got knocked out by, none of that was good news for him. Never the most articulate guy. And then once you took him off the teleprompter and you're speaking off the cuff, we'll finally beat Medicare. It was bad. Kamala Harris, I really think it would be like 5 to 10 years from now. People are going to look back at the Kamala Harris vice presidency and presidential campaign, and Democrats will be like, God, what the hell were we thinking? Look, I had said that Kamala Harris was being underestimated a little bit before Election Day. And if you want to give me a little bit of crow, a little bit of egg with that, but I'll just kind of observe, for somebody who everybody thinks is an idiot, she keeps managing to rise upward and put herself in a situation where everybody else in the Democratic Party is walking across broken glass and working 24/7 to get her, into office. Biden picked her because he'd already said he was going to pick a woman, and there was exceptional pressure to pick an African American. I don't think he ever explicitly said I'm going to pick a black woman, but when you have those two criteria, there were two criteria. There just weren't. He wasn't going to pick the mayor of Atlanta. He wasn't going to pick Susan Rice. Like, this was the only realistic choice. So he picks her. We did it, Joe. And she's in there, and everybody just kind of figured she's going to grow into the role. And in 4 years, she's going to be seen as a realistic option for the presidency. And she just never did. She just every couple of months we get some new profile piece about how her office is chaos. Nobody else in the Biden administration trusts her. She never went to the border. She couldn't take it. Like, it was, even reportedly Biden at some point was fuming. She can't take anything off my plate, meaning there's no duty he feels he can give to her and trust her to take care of it, right? So we kind of have a failing president and effectively a failed vice president. And she gets the job, the nomination 3 months before Election Day, gets more than $1 billion. The media singing her praise, like every conceivable advantage, the wind at her back. I think she actually won the debate. And in the end, the country's like, we'll roll the dice with Trump again. We know what you're offering. We know what we're getting, and we're not impressed. And that's, I think there's going to be a little bit of embarrassment. I think there's going to be kind of a recognition that the Democratic Party believed there was something in her that was never there. And they were constantly in denial for a couple of months. And after election night of this year, it was okay to recognize it. It was okay to admit it. And I think the entire Democratic Party is going to be like, you know what? We want to forget this era. We have actually never figured out how to beat Trump. We've never figured out what it takes to compete. We're in an Aaron Rodgers sensory deprivation, darkness chamber as the year ends. Couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of folks, Greg.
No, those are two good nominees. I think Biden will actually fade, and obviously given his mental state, we probably won't see him much in public after he leaves office. Harris,
mentally, he's already faded into oblivion, but yes.
Yes. Harris at 60, whether it's, I don't know if she'll run for governor of California. I doubt she'll run for president again. If he can't win under the circumstances that she had handed to her, I don't think she even will think about doing it again. But I think she'll find some way to stay in the spotlight just because she loves to be in the spotlight. But we'll see. Maybe she will just go somewhere in the private sector and make gobs of money, fleecing Democratic donors, and we won't actually see that much of her. That'd probably be our best case scenario with Kamala Harris. So for mine, I told you I struggled with this category. My choice for fading into oblivion is my choice for Rising Star last year. Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin, who I had on the rise because, he seemed like he was toying with a Senate race against Tammy Baldwin. He was leading the special select House committee on China. He was getting the Democrats to buy in. They were digging into really meaty stuff and building consensus on calling out China for their spyware and their trade practices and all sorts of other stuff. And then all of a sudden this year, he's like, you know what, I'm out of here. He stuck around to vote against the impeachment of Alejandro Mayorkas, but then left a very tiny House majority. Mike Gallagher just up and left the House. He's not, as far as I know, running for any higher office anytime soon. He's a young guy, so once again, this could blow up in my face, but this seems like a guy who was on a meteoric rise, all of a sudden screeching the brakes and heading back home.
Exceptionally fine work on the House Special Committee on China. My understanding was he had some minor disagreement with some of the more hardliners in the caucus and started getting death threats. Not from the other hardliners, but from the yahoos out there, and decided he didn't want to put his family through it anymore. Hard to disagree with a man wanting to do what's best for his family, but also very annoying that a guy who was so bright, so sharp, and I really feel like a guy who, with the dangers in the Pacific region right now, just exactly the kind of guy you'd like to say sticking around, and a little bit of frustration. Although, Greg, I did just see he did make a book review recommendation for the Wall Street Journal. So he's still active in that sense. But yeah, that's a big step down from being one of the biggest rising stars in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, usually it takes a couple of years for me to get embarrassed in that way. My backup was Kimberly Cheadle, the former director of Secret Service. My guess is she will not be back in any major prominent security roles outside of the private sector, potentially anytime soon.
Yeah, she's probably going to have to rely on her brother Don for House support. So again, no, they are not related, nor do they look the least bit like each other. Yes.
So again, it's Christmas Eve. If you are headed to the Nakatomi Christmas party tonight, consider that carefully. Maybe you want to leave really early. Just come in real quickly at the beginning and leave. Don't park in the parking garage. Just trust me on this. And again, tomorrow our special replay with Robert Davi. And then now the 26th, we'll be back to our awards season. So Jim, Merry Christmas to you. And I'll talk to you again on Thursday.
Greg, Merry Christmas to you and all the Corumbuses out there. Listeners, Merry Christmas. And we will see you in 2 days.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corumbus of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already, and tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a Merry Christmas and join us again tomorrow for the Robert Davi special and back to our awards on the 26th.